These experiences also are associated with a profound sense of clarity. Again, for any of you who have had such an experience, one of the things that most people say is, I understand now. I get it. I understand the world. I understand God. I understand, whatever it is, you understand it. And there was a 37-year-old female scientist who essentially said just that. Everything in life seemed to click. I had this clarity, and it was as if I was looking at my life from the inside out. Despite my trepidation, this experience seemed to satisfy my science or proof-oriented mentality with the concept of intuition. It was almost as if my intuition from somewhere deeper had offered some sort of direct experience that offered up a proof. So here's a scientist who suddenly gets clarity of the world by having this incredible spiritual experience. Where in the brain does clarity occur? Well, we don't know for sure, but there's a very central structure that I haven't talked about yet called the thalamus. And this is a very central structure, and it helps different parts of our brain communicate with each other. And you can see that at rest, these two areas on both sides, you have two of them, are pretty equal in the red intensity. But during a spiritual practice, one side becomes much more active than the other. Now, this is interesting because this area does help different parts of our brain communicate. Some people have argued that this may even be part of where our consciousness derives from. And so this is part of our brain that helps us to make sense of the world. And it's important, I think, that when people are engaged in a spiritual practice like meditation or prayer and have an intense experience, that the thalamus is something that seems to shift that may be associated with that sense of clarity. I've already touched on the sense of unity that people have. Again, we believe that it involves the parietal lobes and is associated with that sense of oneness of God, a oneness of all things. It's the idea that God is a unifying force in the universe. And where might this happen in the brain? Well, in our Franciscan nuns, when we looked at their brain, this is the resting brain, and this is that parietal lobe. You can see that it's pretty equal on both sides during baseline, but when the person is engaged in their prayer practice, this whole side of the parietal lobe becomes much less active. Now, that makes a lot of sense to us because if this area normally turns on to give us our sense of self and differentiate ourselves from the world, if this area shuts down, we begin to lose our sense of self. We no longer can differentiate ourself from the world, ourself from God. And this is something that we see in many of the experiences that people have in which they have this profound sense of unity or oneness. I've already mentioned surrender as well, but let me just give you a little bit better description than I could. This was a 48-year-old Catholic woman, and she said this. She said, I surrendered everything, including my faith and my salvation, and only for one reason. I loved God so much that I would truly give up everything to be connected with him. I said yes, and in an instant, God returned everything to me transformed. From that day forward, a new relationship exists between God and me. It is ever present, no distance, no separation. I am not attached to doctrine, dogmas, or rituals. I see God's actions all around me. So here is actually several different things that we've already talked about. The sense of oneness, there's no distance, no separation, but it arose out of a sense of surrender. She surrendered herself to God, and through that process had a spiritual experience that led to that profound sense of oneness and unity. Again, this is something that we see quite often in our studies, and it has a lot to do with the frontal lobes. This was a study that we did of people who were doing a practice called speaking in tongues, which derives out of the Pentecostal Christian tradition, where they begin to make vocalizations that sound like language, but are not really part of any given language. When they were just doing singing, just doing regular religious singing, they actually activated their frontal lobes, and you can see a fair amount of reddish colors in here. But when they were engaged in speaking in tongues, these areas turned all green. Those areas shut down. And that to me is very interesting, because if the frontal lobe turns on when we are concentrating and purposely doing something, when the frontal lobes shut off, we sense that we are not purposely doing it. It's something that happens to us. And that's exactly what people describe when they describe the experience of speaking in tongues. They are not making it happen. It is something that is happening to them. And in that context, we see these kinds of changes going on in their brain. I mentioned to you earlier the transformative aspect of these experiences, and this came out of our survey. And you can see that when it comes to relationships, the fear of death, a sense of health, a sense of purpose in life, most people, at least over 50 to 80 or even 90%, depending on the category, experience a substantial improvement in these aspects of their life as the result of having a spiritual experience. Now, there were some people who did feel that things went in the opposite direction. And this is also a very important area for neurotheology to look at, when these experiences go badly. And I'll touch on that in a moment. But you can see it's fairly rare, but there still are a small percentage of people where the experiences don't go well. But for the most part, these experiences transform a person and transform them for the positive. And so when we can ask the question of, well, if those things all change, where in the brain is that change occurring? And can we develop longitudinal studies to explore how people's brains change over time when we look, for example, at long-term meditators versus non-meditators, or if we start people on a practice and we see how their brain does by doing that practice. So several years ago, I had the good fortune to do a research study where we had individuals do a kind of meditation called Kirtan Kriya. It's a very simple meditative, a very simple mantra-based practice where they repeat certain phrases, sa, ta, na, and ma, over and over. They do certain finger movements called mudras while they are saying these phrases. And it takes about 12 minutes to do the practice. So we took individuals, we actually took older individuals who had never done meditation before, and we scanned their brains initially, and then we sent them home to do the practice every day for 8 weeks, and we brought them back to scan them again. So you're seeing 4 scans from one individual. We actually did about 15 or 16 individuals in total, and they all had very similar kinds of responses. The A scan is the scan of the person at baseline before we did anything with them. This is just basically coming in to our lab off the street, and this is what their brain looks like. The B scan is what their brain was doing after we taught them how to do the meditation for the very first time, and they were doing the practice for the first time. We sent them home for 8 weeks, they come back, and the C scan now is very similar to the A scan in the sense that they are both baseline or resting scans. And then the D scan is during the final meditation practice. So let's look at the A and the C scan, because these are really the most important results. This is just the brain at rest, not doing anything in particular. And there's 2 very important findings. If we look at the frontal lobes, we can see that it's mostly in green and a little bit of yellow here, but after they come back 8 weeks later, there's much more red here and here. So it's grown in with this red activity compared to what they were at the beginning. Their frontal lobes became more active. That's not during the practice. It's because they had been doing the practice. And this actually turned out that it correlated with improvements in concentration and memory. We were looking at older individuals, and that was what they were interested in. But it was interesting to us that the frontal lobes became more active, and this is consistent with other results that have looked at long-term meditators, which have found that the frontal lobe of long-term meditators is actually thicker than people who are non-meditators. And the analogy, which I think is so simple, is that it's like a muscle, right? If you start to lift weights, what happens to your muscles? They get bigger and they get stronger. And that's kind of what we're seeing with the brain. It literally gets bigger, and our scan showed that it gets stronger. Now, the other area of the brain that also was involved is the thalamus that I mentioned earlier. And you can see in this person, the thalamus was a little bit more active on the left side than on the right side. But when they came back 8 weeks later, it's different. In fact, the other side may even be a little bit more active and becomes even more active when they're actually doing the practice. So this may have a lot to do with why these experiences change the sense of clarity and the way in which a person thinks about the world by affecting the area of our brain that helps all the different parts of our brain communicate with each other. And this is one of the most recent studies that we did, where we sent people through a 7-day spiritual retreat program based on the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. And what happened was we scanned their brain before and after this 7-day retreat, which was a very intensive, very immersive retreat program. These scans look very weird because we're not looking at general brain activity. We gave them a different kind of tracer to look at their brain that is looking at the dopamine areas of the brain. So you haven't heard me mention neurotransmitters yet, but our brain not only has activity in the different areas turn on or off, but it uses different chemicals to do that. So we have chemicals like serotonin, dopamine, and many others that our brain uses to help it function. So when we look at the dopamine areas, which are very central areas in the brain, what happens? Well, you can see that they're very red here, but much less so here. So after the retreat, this particular area of the brain is not acting the same way. Interestingly, what this scan is showing is how the brain is responding to the molecule dopamine. Dopamine is sometimes referred to as the feel-good molecule. It's part of our brain's reward system, and it is released whenever we feel good. So what's happening is that as this area is changing, it's making it more sensitive to when our brain releases dopamine. It makes it such that if we release dopamine, we feel it a lot more. It predisposes us to having a spiritual experience. And that to me made a lot of sense, because when you go through a spiritual retreat, when you do meditation, you don't necessarily have a spiritual experience, but it helps you to ultimately have those kinds of spiritual experiences. And this study actually shows changes in the dopamine system and also in the serotonin system here that helps us to understand the long-term consequences of these practices on the brain. These neurotransmitters, dopamine and serotonin, are also very involved in things like anxiety and depression. So it helps us to understand even more how these spiritual practices may alter a person's psychological well-being. And as you heard in the wonderful talks by Giulio and Alexander, our research looking at Brazilian mediums taught us a lot of things. But one of the important points that it taught us, especially in this context, is that there's a difference between people who are very experienced, very proficient mediums versus those people who did not have the same amount of experience. Their brains actually worked a little bit differently. And that implies that the brains actually can change over time. So this even more shows us how these spiritual practices and experiences change who we are. And that makes a lot of sense. You know, going back to our Kirtan Kriya study, that was 12 minutes a day for 8 weeks. And you can imagine what monks and nuns who are doing these practices for hours a day for years, how that has a profound effect on how their brain operates and how they think and believe about the world around them. Now, as I mentioned, I think a very important point to all of this is to think a little bit about what happens when these practices and these experiences don't go so well. It does happen. And so neurotheology can help us to understand what happens when God gets angry, when religious and spiritual ideas go wrong. Negative perspectives on God can be very detrimental to people. If a person feels that God is trying to punish them or is out to get them, then why should they try to get better when they're fighting a disease like cancer or heart disease? Negative views of God actually have been shown to increase stress, anxiety, and depression in people. And by activating the areas of the brain that are involved in those negative emotions, in the limbic system, like our amygdala. And ultimately, negative ideas about God can cause outward destructive behaviors. So when we talk about terrorism, what's going on in the brain of somebody who is willing to strap a bomb around their chest and blow up a whole bunch of innocent people in the name of God, versus another person who is willing to go out into the world and give completely of themselves to try to help everyone they can in the name of God. So what's going on? What is the difference in those two kinds of brains? And can we ultimately use this information to ideally redirect people to these more positive ways, more compassionate, more empathic, more charitable, more giving ways of being? Perhaps we can learn something by studying the brains of those who are compassionate and empathic and those who are not, and figure out ways of helping those people who are not to be more compassionate and more empathic. So I certainly hope that is. And I certainly hope that is certainly one of my idealistic goals for what neurotheology can bring. And in fact, we have started already to do this. So neuroscience can actually help to clarify practices and beliefs that foster compassion and social cohesion. We know that positive emotions activate brain areas involved with happiness and reward. We release dopamine when somebody gives something to us. We release dopamine when we give something to someone else. When we are engaged in social interactions, our brains become resonant with each other, and we can understand another person. We have what are called mirror neurons that actually reflect in our own brain what other people are doing and thinking and feeling. So if somebody seems sad, we feel sad. If somebody seems happy, we feel happy. And so if we want to make people feel loved, we can exude love, and their brain will feel that. So this research actually helps us to understand that in very, very powerful ways. And and the positive emotions ultimately lower the stress response, improve our overall health and well-being, including our memory and our behaviors. I came across at one point while I was studying this, a story that probably has many variations. I had heard of it as the tale of two wolves, which kind of derives out of the American Indian tradition. And the idea was that there was a child who had gotten into a fight with one of his friends and got very upset, ran to his grandfather and said, I'm really angry at this other boy because he hurt me. He took he took something from me, and I want to beat him up. But I also feel like maybe I should forgive him, and I don't know what to do. I'm very conflicted. And the grandfather said, inside each one of us are two wolves. There's one wolf which is very selfish and very angry and very quick to hatred, and the other wolf is very loving and compassionate and forgiving. And they're constantly fighting it out inside of each of us. And the child thinks about that for a moment, and he says, well, then ultimately, which wolf wins that battle? And the grandfather says to the boy, he says, it is the wolf that you feed that is the one that wins the battle. And what that means is that the more we are compassionate, the more we practice those positive emotions and those positive behaviors, the more that is the way we are as a human being. And that's exactly what the neuroscience shows us, that the more we engage certain neural connections, including those that support love and compassion, the stronger those neural connections become, and it changes the brain in the ways that we can see on those brain scans, so that we can see more dopamine, more of other areas of our brain that help us to have social interactions and to feel that empathy, love, and compassion for others. So in a continuing effort to understand our world, in a continuing effort to understand ourselves, we will never stop having beliefs about religion, about spirituality, about the concept of God. God changes our brain in many ways. And again, this does not going back to one of my earliest slides, it doesn't matter if God exists for this statement. What I mean is that whether God actually exists or not, the belief that people have in God changes their brain. The disbelief that people have in God changes their brain. So God changes our brain in many ways, and these religious and spiritual ideas affect our thoughts, our perceptions, our feelings, and our behaviors. We can perceive God, we can perceive religion and spirituality positively. We can perceive God, religion, and spirituality negatively. But ultimately, understanding this helps us to understand ourselves and improve ourselves on both an individual as well as on a global level. So I will leave it there. And thank you very much.